Okay, so we're going to talk now about wind erosion. I'm going to talk briefly about the mechanics of wind erosion, how to measure it. I've already talked about some soil moisture controls in an earlier lecture, so we're going to skip that. And we're going to talk about aeolian landforms because there are mine sites being developed in aeolian landforms. And if you're going to rehabilitate them, then you're going to have sediments that are moving around, and it'll be worthwhile understanding a bit of aeolian geomorphology if you're going to start reconstructing those types of landscapes. And of course, a little bit on vegetation impacts of erosion. So wind erosion, like water erosion, has the same sorts of processes. With wind, we have particles that can roll across the surface via creep, or in a river that would be bedload. Then we can have saltation, which is particles that are briefly deposited up into the air column and then land again. And then finally we have suspended load, which is particles that are brought up high up into the wind column and then transported large distances. There are features of aeolian processes. There are indicators of the dominance of aeolian processes in desert landscapes, for example. And some of these are sometimes called venticats or venticat formation. And these are indicators that aeolian sediment transport is perhaps a dominant process. So for example, if you have a predominant wind direction and you have rocks on the soil surface, then the soil particles that impact those rocks can cause smooth sides of some of those rocks if they've been there for a long period of time at the surface, and they basically abrade away these facets, right, that are quite smooth. And they're indicators both of the direction of dominant sediment transport, but also that sediment transport is quite a significant mechanism for the movement of soils. As we said before, we can get rock armouring in deserts, and one of the mechanisms is wind. Water can also do the same thing, but wind essentially does sort of things. So if you have a deposit which is a mixture of rock and soil, with enough wind erosion, you can get desert pavements forming, and these are rocks that essentially have accumulated at the soil surface, not because they've been deposited there, but because the soil, the sands above them and between them have been blown away by the wind. And once the rock pavement is there, then it prevents further erosion of the sands or soils. So this is one mechanism anyway for measuring wind erosion of sediments. Here is a set of wind vanes, and these can all sort of flip around and point in the direction of the wind. And inside them they have little microphones that measure the impact of particles on the microphone. And you can count the number of hits at various heights and get an estimate then of the total amount of sediment transported. So this volcano here had me stranded in Copenhagen for only a few hours, luckily, but when the Eyjafjallajökull volcano went off, it sent dust all over northern Europe, and airplanes were grounded because of the dust that was emitted. So I'm going to show you some data from these guys who are actually measuring dust and sediment transport from this volcanic event. And here you can see the lines from two eruptions were at different dates. 17th of April is the blue one, 14th to the 16th of April is the red one, and the reason they're in different directions is because of changing wind patterns at the times the volcano was going off. So these little emitters here were able to count the number of pulse counts per minute, so that every time a particle hit the microphone, it emitted a little pulse. And they could count the number of pulse counts per minute as a function of average wind speed. And you can see clearly here, there's nearly a threshold velocity, right? So you get up to about 12 meters per second, and there's almost no pulses happening. And then you get to 15, and then all of a sudden then there's a linear increase in the number of pulse counts as a function of the wind speed. Okay, so there's a clear threshold velocity And above that, then you start to get significant amounts of wind erosion being measured in your detectors. And these other two figures show, how the sediment is actually transported vertically in the column. So this is the relative amount of dust above, below a certain point. So the lowest detector was sitting here at about, 15 centimeters above the ground. And then they had detectors at 30, 60, 90 and 1.20 meters. And so as you went higher, you get less and less of the total dust being transported higher up into the wind column. This is what some of those detectors look like. So essentially it's just a microphone, got a wind vane here, so it points the detector in the direction of where the wind is coming from, and a little pivot so it can spin around. And so every time a dust particle hits it, it creates a little electrical pulse, which is measured as the impact of the sound. There's also impact sensors which you can install, so that might be sitting inside one of these type of things, or you can just have them sitting out in the wind like that. A little piezoelectric sensor instead of a microphone. It's a little pressure sensor, so every time a little dust particle hits it, it creates a pressure at the surface, and that's recorded as a little pulse. And there's also suspended dust samplers, so if you want to sample parcels of air and store them and then analyse what was actually transported in terms of their particle size or their which type of soils were actually transported, then you can have a little tube which is actually collecting dust and then storing it in a sample for later analysis. People do experiments using portable wind tunnels. So here's a centrifuge. It blows through this little chamber here, which is several meters long and maybe only a meter wide, and maybe a half a meter high or something. And you can install this over certain experiments, for example. And you might have your working section here. You might have dust collectors, or you might have cameras in there taking pictures. And you may be collecting what's coming out the other end. Right, so that's a little bit about measuring wind erosion. And we're going to look at the impact of vegetation. And vegetation has really interesting impacts on erosion, both in terms of water and fluid. So the next few slides relate both to water and wind. So we have isolated patches of vegetation in a flow field. So here's our wind blowing across the top. Then what happens is the wind wants to blow over the top of these isolated patches of vegetation, and we get turbulent eddies forming both in the front of the vegetation but also in the lee side, which causes localized sediment transport, as well as this regional flow field which is causing long range sediment transport. So when they're wide apart, then the wind can blow over and then come back down to the surface again and then interact with the sediments further away. Whereas when the vegetation becomes closer and closer together, then the flow will tend to skim over the top of the vegetation, and only a little bit of the eddies, or the turbulent eddies that come down from the flow, will get in between the vegetation and interact with the soil surface. So vegetation spacing has an impact on how the sediment transport happens. And of course, the flow velocity is going to determine how strong these eddies are going to be to get down to the soil surface. So there's a relationship between, your variability of your winds and what the impacts are going to be between vegetation. So these guys did an experiment. I've got some references down the track, where they set up patches of vegetation in a wind field, and they coloured some soil so you could actually see the sediment transport happening. And they came up with sort of regions of influence around plants, denoted B, C, D and A here, which describe different processes that were going on. And you can see this in the next few slides, so I'll let you guys read the bottom the bottom bits to see what's going on. So here's their experimental chamber. They had wind coming in at one end, and they had a patch here of red coloured sand, which had the same particle size. It was just painted slightly differently, painted sand. And then they put in different densities of these plants, right, in the chamber to look at the impact on the sediment transport. And these are some of the images of what's going on, right? So they had, here's a patch of plant, and in the lee of the plant, there's very little of that red sand being deposited, but in between, you get patches of it. And you can see here the difference between when you have a higher vegetation density as opposed to a lower vegetation density up here. And these figures just show similar sorts of things with slightly different experiments using different coloured sands of different sizes. I think the red and the blue denote different sized sand particles. And the red being slightly larger, I think. So you can see that the blue particles have all been washed out because they're much finer and more susceptible to sediment transport. Whereas up here, the red particles are a little bit heavier, and you get more of them being left behind. Interesting flow patterns though. So in their experiments, they were able to calculate a normalized sediment transport rate, right, QN, as a function of the horizontal vegetation cover. Right. So with no vegetation, they had the highest sediment transport rates, and as the vegetation cover increased to 45%, then they got a reasonable logarithmic decrease in the sediment transport, right? An exponential decrease in the sediment transport with vegetation cover, which is described by this little equation here. So how does vegetation impact the flow? Well, we saw some of that in the diagram earlier, right? So we have a smooth surface, we have a velocity profile of the wind, which looks like this, logarithmically increasing with height. If we have a rough surface, we have a break in the velocity profile, so it starts off low and then rapidly increases through the canopy, and then we have this, again, this logarithmic profile. When we have laminar flow, on the other hand, this was turbulent flow, and this is laminar flow. Then again, we have a small break here, but we have relatively linear increase in velocity with height. And in this case, with laminar flow, we get a break. We get zero velocity near the canopy, and then a linear increase with height. But of course, as we saw in some of the first diagrams, when we have some sort of obstacle or a bit of vegetation in the wind field, then we get really complex flow behaviours. We can get eddies being shed in turbulent flow in the air, eddies being shed sideways, and both in the lee and in the foreground of the obstacle, which causes the sediment transport to be quite complex. So how do you control erosion? Well, at mine sites, you can spray this green mulch over the top. Sometimes it's made up of organic matter with paper, and sometimes it's just a different type of soil, or sometimes it's a chemical, which is just sprayed over the surface with interparticle bonding, right, which protects the surface from the wind. Most often at mine sites, you'll see the application of water to prevent dust. And watering is a big factor which controls dust. Sometimes they include salts in here, which increases the potential for the soil to bond. But of course that will depend upon the mineralogy. And in farming systems, often you'll see crop residues being left behind, so a bit of stubble. And because of the high amounts of erosion that happened in the 30s, 40s and 50s and 60s in Western Australia, stubble retention has been a big factor which has reduced the amount of wind erosion impacting Western Australian agricultural soils. So what type of landscapes do we get in aeolian landscapes? Well, Sand dunes, right, is the most common. And they're sort of self-organised features. So we get wind, which blows up sediments, and it blows up sediments up until a certain height, and then the system develops this slip face. So sediments pile up here, then they can't keep piling up because there's nothing on the other side, and then because of the steepness of the slope, then the sediments slip down and cascade and form a consistent build-up of layers, right? You can see that you get these consistent deposition layers on the far side of the dune, and over time, gradually, you can see that the dune will propagate forward. The dune can't keep growing in height forever because we get less and less sediment being transported with height, and also the flow field changes. The higher up we go, then the more our wind velocity changes. And so there's only so high these sand dunes can build up. But the types of sand dunes that we get can be really quite varied. So we can have these barkhand dunes with a horseshoe-like shape, with a horseshoe pointing in the direction that the wind is going. And they're crescent-shaped dunes. Often you need one or two, at least two directions from where the wind is blowing over time to generate these systems. And this is how barkhand dunes are sort of formed. You get airflow over the top of the dune, you get a turbulent eddy, which is formed on the downwind side, and then we get flow over the edges, which helps spread out the dune. Right? And this turbulent eddy helps restrict the flow of sediments forward in the middle of the dune, and the shape of this turbulence then causes the flow field to spread out further away and leads to the generation of those horns, right, which extend downwind. You get transverse dunes, so these are dunes that gradually propagate in the direction of the wind, like barkhand dunes, and essentially they're much more stable, so they don't develop the horns. Right? You need different type of wind conditions for that to occur. Often vegetation is scarce and sand supply is plentiful in these cases. There's some more pictures of some transverse dunes. Then you get barchanoid dunes, a sort of intermediate between transverse and barkhand dunes. They're starting to develop the horns, but they don't quite get there. And then you get seef or longitudinal dunes, so these are dunes that are actually parallel to the prevailing wind direction. You have only moderate sand supply, and these seef dunes or longitudinal dunes occur over large parts of northwestern Australia. They can be hundreds of kilometres long. In Western Australia they're not quite that high, but they can get up to 100 metres high. And typically they're, say, 10 to 15 metres high, but in North America and in Africa they can be 60 metres high easily. And so that's what they look like, direction of the wind flow. As the wind flows down, you get this vortex being generated, which causes dunes to form on either side of the vortex. And you get interactions between vortices, which helps to stabilise these channels along which the dunes form. Alright, that's what sort of what they look like. And then you can get blowout or parabolic dunes, right? Horseshoe-shaped horns which point upwind, the opposite of barkhand dunes. These blowouts or parabolic dunes develop from transverse dunes, but there must have been something to happen to change the sediment transport rates, right? So maybe some vegetation was removed, maybe the wind velocities increased suddenly or something. And often there's an interaction between vegetation. So sometimes the horns are vegetated, but the rest is not, right? And the centre of the dune moves downwards. So this is what they look like. Where the wind is flowing this way, the horns point up into the wind, and then this central part is blown out and is the actively moving component. And vegetation is able to occupy the horns because the sediment is much more stable and gives the chance for the vegetation to establish and grow. And some pictures of some parabolic dunes from Colorado. And finally, star dunes. They're really quite interesting. They've seen these on Mars. And star dunes come about because you have highly variable wind directions. You might have 3 seasonal components of the wind field that change during the year, and that causes the dunes to form in one direction part of the year, then another direction, then another direction, which ends up producing these stable star dunes. Okay, and there's a picture of some there. That's all I got.